My argument this week has been that of all Shakespeare's plays, The Merry Wives of Windsor is the one that brings us closest to his own origins. The world of his childhood, of his youth, the world of Stratford-upon-Avon, of small-town life, is brought alive through the story of Falstaff and the Merry Wives of Windsor. Windsor stands in for Stratford, but there are many references back to Stratford. Justice Shallow and his friends have come up from Gloucestershire. There are those references to the Cotswolds. There's the possibility that the play is teasing Sir Thomas Lucy, the local landowner who allegedly was the man whose park Shakespeare stole game from. At the same time, the Latin lesson with the boy Will clearly replicates and makes a joke of the kind of education that Shakespeare got in the grammar school at Stratford-upon-Avon. At the same time, however, the consequence of that Latin lesson is opening up a wider world to Shakespeare and a wider knowledge, including a knowledge of the classics, which is what makes possible the comparison of Falstaff to Actaeon, who oversees the naked Diana as she is bathing. One of the best ways of understanding Shakespeare is by remembering that he lived in a culture that was deeply influenced both by Christianity and in particular by the recent fact of the religious Reformation, and also by the classics, by those texts that he studied in school. The image of Falstaff wearing his horns as if he's a deer, the final scene of the play, the final denouement, where we simultaneously have him referred to as Herne the Hunter, a character out of English folklore, and as Actaeon, a character out of classical mythology, is perhaps further complicated if we think about the picture that I've got here in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Shakespeare Stratford. As far as we can work out, this is a representation of a biblical scene, an Old Testament scene that was very frequently painted. It's known as Susanna and the Elders, and it comes from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, although from a sequence of the book of Daniel which Protestants and Catholics had rather different views of, insofar as one church thought that it was part of the proper biblical canon and the other church thought that it wasn't. It's a story about two religious elders who, in a garden, oversee, or overhear, overlook a beautiful woman called Susanna. And they are rather lecherous, exactly in the same way that old Falstaff is lecherous, and indeed that Actaeon in the classical myth is lecherous. What then happens is that they falsely accuse Susanna of having had sex with a young man. That would have led to her being condemned to death. But Daniel comes as effectively as a lawyer and cross-examines them, and he reveals the flaw in their testimony, that one of them says that the event took place under one particular kind of tree, and the other says it was under another kind of tree. And so it's shown that they're making it up because really they want to get their hands on Susanna themselves. The moment in The Merchant of Venice when Portia, in disguise as a brilliant young lawyer, is described as a very Daniel, the idea of a brilliant lawyer coming up with a brilliant argument. That refers to this story, to the skill of Daniel. But it's a provocative image to look at because it gives you an idea of old men associated with lechery and young women associated with beauty. Susanna is certainly beautiful. The artist here has represented her in somewhat diaphanous clothes, so the outline of her body, including her breasts, are very, very clear. Women, clearly, in much of the poetry, the art of Shakespeare's time, are represented as sexual objects, objects of desire. The brilliance of Merry Wives of Windsor comes from the way in which Falstaff's desire is mercilessly mocked. the way in which the women are always on top, the women are in control. Every time he wants to get his way with them, they're one step ahead of him. As well as being humiliated in the final scene, there's also the great sequence where the news comes that one of the women's husbands, Ford, is returning, and Falstaff is put into a buck basket, a linen basket, and taken out of the house. He describes the events in retrospect, how he's conveyed into a buck basket. Rammed me in with foul shirts and smocks, socks, foul stockings, greasy napkins. That, Master Broom, there was the rankest compound of villainous smell that ever offended nostril. Being thus crammed in the basket, a couple of knaves were called forth by their mistress to carry me in the name of foul clothes to Datchet Lane, stopped in like a strong distillation with stinking clothes that fretted in their own grease. Think of that! A man of my kidney, think of that! That am as subject to heat as butter, a man of continual dissolution and thaw. It was a miracle to escape suffocation. And in the height of this bath, when I was more than half stewed in grease like a Dutch dish, to be thrown into the Thames and cooled, glowing hot, in that surge like a horseshoe. Think of that. Hissing hot. Think of that. Wonderful comic indignation of Falstaff. But what's marvellous about this passage is the way that it draws on the everyday, the image of ordinary women's work, the idea of a basket of linen being conveyed to the river, to Datchet Lane, in order to be washed. Domestic work was tough in Shakespeare's time. They didn't have washing machines and vacuum cleaners. Everything had to be done by hand. I've got here from the library of the Birthplace Trust a wonderful handbook which was reprinted many times in Shakespeare's time. It was called The English Housewife, containing the inward and outward virtues which ought to be in a complete woman, as her skill in physic, surgery, cookery, extraction of oils, banqueting stuff, ordering of great feasts, preserving of all sorts of wines, conceited secrets, distillations, perfumes, ordering of wool, hemp, flax, making clothes and dyeing, her knowledge of dairies, the office of malting, of oats, of brewing, baking, all other things belonging to a household. And one particular sequence, which concerns skill in whitening of yarn, gives a very detailed description of the process of bucking. Shakespeare seems to have actually invented that compound noun, buck basket. But the idea of buck, a buck, it was a word that meant a pile of linen. Your buck is basically your laundry. And you had a bucking tub, a wash tub. So you had the option of using a bucking tub or using the river. The advantage of the bucking tub is that you can put in it water that was known as lye. Lye was water that had had something like ash put in it. The description here involves slippings of ash. Ash, of course, is alkaline, so the lye is alkaline water. It's effectively like soapy water, and the alkali helps to wash out the grease from the clothes. So women had to have great skill as well as being able to work very, very hard. Markham's book gives a real sense of what it was like to be a good housewife in the period. And The Merry Wives of Windsor, as the play is called, is very, very closely tuned to hussifry. And Shakespeare seems to have special respect for these two women who are so successful in bringing Falstaff down to earth and eventually chucking him into the water, which is no less than he deserves. So what we've seen in Merry Wives of Windsor is how all sorts of aspects of Shakespeare's world, his small town life, his classical education, the religious background, the role of the women, how all this comes together in a play that spoke so strongly to his own time. It was said that The Merry Wives of Windsor was specially commissioned by Queen Elizabeth because she so loved the character of Falstaff, who first appeared in the Henry IV plays. Whether or not that was the case, there's no doubt that Elizabeth and all other female audience members take special pleasure in this work.